They say the deepest heartbreak is not when your child leaves home, but when they make you feel like you no longer belong in their life. I never imagined those words would one day become my own story. My name is Thomas Bennett, and for nearly 4 decades I worked with my hands to build an honest life in a small Kentucky town. I was never wealthy. I drove the same old dark green pickup truck for more than 20 years, lived in the same modest brick house where my late wife and I raised our only son, Daniel, and believed that keeping your word mattered more than impressing strangers. My wife passed away 8 years earlier after a long illness, and from that day forward Daniel became the only family I had left. I poured everything I had into helping him attend college, start his career, and build a future brighter than my own. When he met Emily, I welcomed her with an open heart. She came from a successful family whose parents owned several businesses, lived in a beautiful estate outside Louisville, and moved comfortably through social circles that had always been far beyond my experience. I never envied their wealth. I simply hoped they would love my son as much as I did. At first everything seemed fine. Daniel visited every Sunday afternoon, we shared coffee on the porch, and he still laughed at the stories about fixing tractors and repairing old engines together. But after the wedding, little things began to change. Sunday visits quietly disappeared. Phone calls became shorter. Holiday plans were suddenly arranged around Emily's parents, and I was told they had larger homes for entertaining guests. Daniel always apologized politely, explaining that it was simply easier for everyone. I told him I understood because I never wanted to become a burden. Months passed before I realized I had slowly become a visitor in my own son's life. Then one Friday afternoon Daniel called and invited me to his father-in-law's birthday celebration. I felt genuinely excited because it had been nearly 3 months since we had all been together. I spent the morning washing my old pickup truck, pressed my favorite flannel shirt, polished my work boots, and even stopped at a local bakery to buy a homemade pecan pie because I remembered Emily's father mentioning years earlier that it reminded him of his childhood. As I drove toward the impressive mansion where the party was being held, expensive luxury cars lined both sides of the long circular driveway. Men in tailored suits stood talking beside polished sport utility vehicles while elegantly dressed guests carried expensive gifts inside. My old pickup seemed almost invisible among them. I parked near the far end of the property so it would not be in anyone's way. Carrying the warm pie carefully in both hands, I walked toward the front entrance with a hopeful smile, believing family would always recognize family before anything else. I had no idea that before the evening was over, I would overhear a conversation that would completely change the way I understood my own son and the people he had chosen to call family. The moment I stepped through the front door, I realized I had entered a world that no longer felt familiar. Soft piano music drifted through the spacious mansion while crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Waiters moved quietly among elegantly dressed guests carrying silver trays filled with expensive appetizers. Conversations flowed easily about investment opportunities, vacation homes, and international travel. I smiled politely at everyone who happened to make eye contact, holding my homemade pecan pie carefully as though it belonged there just as much as the expensive bottles of wine and beautifully wrapped gifts stacked on a nearby table. Daniel noticed me from across the room and walked over with a friendly smile, but something about it felt different. He gave me a quick hug instead of the warm embrace we once shared and immediately glanced toward another group waiting for him. He thanked me for coming, accepted the pie, and quietly suggested that I leave it in the kitchen because his mother-in-law had arranged the dessert table herself. His words were polite, yet they carried an uncomfortable distance that lingered longer than the conversation itself. Emily greeted me kindly and asked how I had been doing, but before we could speak, for more than a minute, her mother gently interrupted, explaining that several important guests had just arrived and Emily should help welcome them. I assured them it was perfectly fine and wandered toward the backyard where dozens of people stood beneath elegant string lights overlooking beautifully landscaped gardens. Everywhere I looked, people seemed perfectly comfortable with one another except for me. I found a quiet seat near the edge of the patio, content simply to watch Daniel enjoying himself. He looked successful, confident, and genuinely happy. Part of me felt proud because every sacrifice his mother and I had made appeared to have helped him build a wonderful life. Even if I no longer fit naturally into that world, seeing him smile still mattered more than my own comfort. As the evening continued, Daniel's father-in-law stood to give a birthday toast. He spoke warmly about family, legacy, and surrounding yourself with people who elevated your future. The guests applauded enthusiastically while Daniel stood beside him looking almost like a second son. I joined the applause with everyone else, although a quiet ache settled deeper inside my heart. After dinner I excused myself to find the restroom. Walking down a long hallway, I noticed voices coming from a nearby study whose door had been left slightly open. I recognized Daniel's voice immediately. I had no intention of listening, but just as I prepared to continue walking, I heard my own name spoken. My feet stopped without thinking. One of Emily's relatives laughed softly and asked whether Daniel planned to keep inviting his father to family events. Daniel answered with a tired sigh that cut far deeper than any angry words ever could. He said he loved me, but admitted that his father-in-law's family opened doors that his own father never could. He quietly added that sometimes he wished I looked and acted more like the successful people in the room because it would make everything less awkward. Every word echoed through the silent hallway. Standing there unseen, I realized that the greatest distance between a father and his son is not measured in miles. Sometimes it is measured by the value one person places on another. For several long seconds I remained frozen outside the study, hoping I had misunderstood what I had heard. Perhaps Daniel was simply trying to fit into a difficult conversation. Perhaps he felt pressure to say things he did not truly believe. But then another voice asked whether I still lived in the same modest house outside town, and Daniel answered quietly that I probably always would because I had never wanted anything more. Someone chuckled and remarked that some people simply lacked ambition. Daniel did not laugh, but he did not defend me either. That silence hurt far more than the words themselves. I quietly stepped away before anyone noticed I had been standing there. Taking a slow breath, I walked out to the backyard and sat alone beneath a large oak tree overlooking the gardens. Around me the celebration continued exactly as before. Glasses clinked together, people laughed, and photographs were taken to capture another perfect family gathering. No one realized that something inside me had quietly broken. I did not feel angry. I felt strangely empty. For years I had believed that love between a parent and a child could survive almost anything. Yet sitting there alone, I began wondering whether success sometimes convinced people that the sacrifices behind their own lives had become too ordinary to remember. A few minutes later Emily found me sitting by myself. She smiled warmly and asked if everything was all right because she had noticed I disappeared after dinner. I forced a smile and told her I had simply needed a little fresh air. She looked concerned for a moment but accepted my answer. Before she returned to the guests, she thanked me again for bringing the pecan pie, saying it reminded her of the first Thanksgiving she spent at our home years earlier. Her kindness reminded me that not everyone in the family had forgotten where we came from. Soon afterward Daniel walked outside carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me and apologized for not spending more time together during the evening. He explained that Emily's parents had invited many business associates and he wanted to make a good impression. I nodded and told him I understood. I never mentioned what I had overheard because I wanted him to have the opportunity to speak honestly without being cornered by guilt. Instead, I simply asked whether he was truly happy. He answered yes without hesitation, but his eyes drifted away before the word had fully left his mouth. We stood together in silence watching the lights across the lawn. Eventually he glanced toward the mansion and said he should get back before people started looking for him. He placed a hand briefly on my shoulder and walked away without realizing that the distance between us had become much greater than the few yards separating the patio from the garden. After another half hour I quietly slipped out without saying goodbye to anyone except the valet who smiled politely as he watched my old pickup truck pull away from the mansion. The drive home felt much longer than usual. The familiar Kentucky roads were almost empty beneath the evening sky, giving me far too much time to replay every conversation in my mind. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a dusty cardboard box waiting on the front porch. It had been delivered while I was gone. Across the top, written in handwriting I recognized immediately, were the words, "For Thomas Bennett. Please open this when you are ready to know the whole truth." For several minutes I simply stood on the porch staring at the box without touching it. The handwriting immediately brought back memories because I had seen it many times over the years. It belonged to Margaret Ellis, my late wife's closest friend. After my wife passed away, Margaret moved to another state to live closer to her daughter, and although we exchanged Christmas cards every year, we rarely spoke anymore. I carried the box inside, placed it gently on the kitchen table, and slowly removed the tape. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a small wooden jewelry box, and an envelope with my name written across the front. I opened the letter first. Margaret explained that my wife had entrusted the box to her shortly before her illness became severe. She had asked Margaret to keep it safe until the day she believed I truly needed it. Margaret wrote that she never imagined it would take 8 years before that day arrived, but after hearing through mutual friends that Daniel had become distant, she felt it was finally time for me to have what my wife wanted me to see. With trembling hands I opened the wooden box. Resting inside was my wife's wedding ring, a collection of old family photographs, and a small leather journal that I had never seen before. The first page was dated just months before she passed away. She had written about watching Daniel grow into a capable young man while worrying that success might one day surround him with people who measured worth differently than we had taught him. She prayed that he would never confuse wealth with character or influence with love. As I continued reading, tears blurred the words, not because they were sad, but because every sentence sounded exactly like the woman who had shared my life for more than 30 years. Then I reached a page that stopped me completely. My wife described a private conversation she once had with Emily during the early days of Daniel's engagement. Emily had confessed that she loved Daniel deeply but worried that her own parents often judged people by appearances and financial status. My wife encouraged her never to let that attitude become the foundation of her marriage. She believed Daniel possessed a kind heart and hoped he would always remember where he came from. Closing the journal for a moment, I leaned back in my chair and looked around the quiet house. Every room held memories of simpler days when our greatest concern had been paying the mortgage on time or deciding where to spend a family picnic on a sunny Saturday. I wondered what my wife would have done if she had heard Daniel's words that evening. I knew she would not have responded with anger. She would have searched for the pain hidden beneath his mistakes. Before putting everything away, I noticed one final envelope tucked beneath the folders. Unlike the others, it had never been sealed. Across the front my wife had written only a few simple words: "Give this to Daniel when he is finally ready to understand what being rich truly means." I stared at the envelope for a long time, realizing that whatever truth my wife had left behind was never meant for me alone. Somehow, someday, it was meant to change my son's life as well. I carefully placed the unopened envelope back inside the wooden box and locked everything in the small desk drawer where my wife used to keep our family papers. Deep inside I wanted to call Daniel immediately and demand an explanation for everything I had heard the previous evening, but every page of my wife's journal seemed to whisper the same advice. Wait. Listen. Give love one more chance before judgment. The following morning I followed my usual routine. I made coffee, watered the flowers my wife had planted years before, and drove into town to pick up groceries. Life looked exactly the same as it always had, yet nothing inside me felt familiar anymore. Everywhere I went people greeted me warmly. The cashier at the grocery store asked about my garden. An elderly neighbor waved as I drove past. The owner of the local hardware store insisted on helping me load supplies into my truck even though I told him I could manage. Those ordinary moments reminded me that respect had never depended on expensive clothes or impressive addresses. It had always grown from years of treating people with kindness. Late that afternoon my telephone rang. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. For a brief moment I considered letting the call go unanswered, but I picked up anyway. He apologized for being busy after the party and asked whether I had made it home safely. His voice sounded normal, almost cheerful, as though nothing unusual had happened. I answered calmly and told him everything was fine. There was a long pause before he mentioned that Emily's parents wanted to host another family dinner the following weekend because several relatives who had been traveling would finally be in town. He said everyone hoped I could come. I thanked him for the invitation and said I would think about it. Before ending the call, I asked a simple question that caught him completely off guard. I asked whether he remembered the small two-bedroom house where he grew up. He laughed softly and said of course he did. I asked whether he remembered the nights when his mother and I skipped buying new clothes so we could save money for his college tuition. His voice became quieter as he answered yes. Then I asked whether he believed those years had been something to feel embarrassed about. Another silence filled the line. Finally he said, "No, Dad. I just think life is different now." Those 6 words stayed with me long after the call ended. Life was different. Perhaps that was true. But values were never supposed to change simply because circumstances improved. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the Kentucky hills, I returned to my wife's journal and continued reading. Near the final pages she had copied a handwritten Bible verse about storing treasures that neither time nor circumstances could ever take away. Beneath it she had added one final sentence in her own handwriting. She wrote, "The day Daniel forgets this lesson, God will gently place someone in his path to remind him." I closed the journal slowly, never imagining that within only a few days an unexpected visitor would arrive at my front door carrying the first piece of a truth that neither my son nor I had ever known. 3 days passed before anyone came to my door. Early on Tuesday morning I heard a car pull into the driveway. Expecting a delivery truck, I glanced through the window and was surprised to see a modest silver sedan instead of one of the luxury vehicles that usually visited our neighborhood. A woman in her early 60s stepped out carrying a leather folder. Although time had added gray to her hair, I recognized Margaret Ellis immediately. We embraced like old friends who had somehow allowed too many years to pass between visits. After we settled into the kitchen with fresh coffee, she looked around the house and smiled softly, saying almost nothing had changed since my wife was alive. I told her I had kept everything the way we had built it together because it still felt like home. Margaret nodded with understanding before growing unusually serious. She explained that she had not come only because of the box. There was something my wife had never wanted either of us to forget. According to Margaret, during the final months of her illness my wife became deeply concerned that Daniel would eventually mistake financial success for personal worth. She believed it would not happen intentionally. She simply feared that constant exposure to wealthy people might slowly reshape the way he measured value. Margaret reached into her folder and removed several handwritten letters. They were copies of correspondence between my wife and her during those difficult months. As I read them, I realized how often they had prayed together for Daniel's future. They never prayed that he would become rich. They prayed that he would remain humble regardless of how successful he became. Margaret then told me something that completely changed the way I viewed recent events. A few months earlier she had unexpectedly run into Emily at a grocery store while visiting relatives in Louisville. Emily had looked exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed. During their conversation she quietly admitted that she often felt trapped between 2 families. She loved Daniel and respected me deeply, but her own parents constantly encouraged Daniel to spend more time building relationships that could advance his career. They rarely criticized me directly, yet they frequently described me as someone from a different world whose simple lifestyle no longer reflected the future they envisioned for their daughter and son-in-law. Emily confessed that she disagreed with them but struggled to challenge their opinions without creating conflict inside her own family. Hearing this, I realized Daniel might have been living under pressures I had never fully understood. His choices were still his own, but perhaps the story was more complicated than wounded pride alone. Before leaving, Margaret handed me one final document. It was a folded sheet written entirely in my wife's handwriting. At the bottom she had listed 3 simple instructions. First, never allow disappointment to replace love. Second, never expose someone's weakness when patience can still heal it. Third, when the truth finally comes, let it teach before it punishes. I folded the paper carefully and placed it inside my shirt pocket close to my heart. As Margaret drove away, I stood quietly in the driveway watching the empty road ahead. For the first time since the birthday party, I sensed that the truth I had been searching for was beginning to reveal itself one careful step at a time, and I had no idea that the very next phone call would bring Daniel to my front porch sooner than either of us expected. The phone rang just after breakfast the following morning. Seeing Daniel's name again, I sensed immediately that something had changed. His voice no longer carried the confidence I had heard only a few days earlier. Instead, it sounded uncertain, almost hesitant. He asked whether he could stop by after work because there was something important he wanted to discuss in person. I agreed without asking questions. Late that afternoon, his car pulled into the driveway. Watching from the kitchen window, I noticed he remained seated behind the steering wheel for nearly a full minute before finally stepping outside. He looked tired, as though he had not slept well in days. When he entered the house, everything felt strangely familiar. He automatically removed his shoes near the front door exactly as his mother had taught him years ago. Without thinking, he walked into the kitchen and smiled faintly at the old family photographs still hanging on the wall. For a brief moment I caught a glimpse of the young boy he used to be before adulthood complicated so many simple things. We sat across from each other with fresh coffee between us. Daniel apologized for visiting without much notice, then admitted he had been feeling overwhelmed. He explained that work had become increasingly demanding and that Emily's parents expected him to join one of their business ventures. According to them, it would be a tremendous opportunity that could accelerate his career and eventually place him in a leadership position. Yet accepting the offer came with expectations that extended far beyond the office. More family gatherings, more social events, more networking, and gradually less time for everything else. I listened quietly without interrupting. Eventually he looked directly at me and asked whether I thought people change because of money or because of the people surrounding them. The question surprised me because it revealed a conflict I had not expected him to admit. I answered honestly that money simply made it easier for people to become more of whoever they already were. Character was built long before wealth ever arrived. Daniel lowered his eyes toward his coffee cup and remained silent. After several moments he confessed that lately he often felt as though he belonged to two completely different worlds. One valued reputation, influence, and appearances. The other valued honesty, hard work, and simple moments around an old kitchen table. He admitted that trying to satisfy both had left him exhausted. I almost told him about everything I had overheard at the birthday party, but my wife's final instructions echoed once again in my mind. Let the truth teach before it punishes. Instead, I simply asked whether he and Emily were happy together. He smiled sincerely and said they loved each other very much. The real difficulty was not their marriage. It was everything surrounding it. Before leaving, Daniel stood near the front door and looked back into the living room. His eyes rested on the old framed photograph of our family taken during a summer picnic many years earlier. Quietly he said he missed those days more than he ever admitted. Then he thanked me for listening without judging him. As his car disappeared down the road, I felt hope for the first time since the birthday celebration. Yet only a few hours later an unexpected phone call from Emily would reveal that the greatest misunderstanding between our families had not even begun to surface. Later that evening my telephone rang just as I was preparing dinner. This time it was Emily. Her voice was gentle but carried a nervousness I had never heard before. She apologized for calling unexpectedly and asked whether she could speak honestly without Daniel knowing. I assured her she could. After a long pause she admitted she had been trying to protect everyone for far too long. She explained that ever since the wedding she had noticed Daniel slowly changing, not because he suddenly became selfish, but because he desperately wanted approval from people he believed could shape his future. Her parents never directly told him to distance himself from me. Instead they constantly praised ambition, status, and professional connections while quietly dismissing ordinary lives as wasted potential. Without realizing it, Daniel began measuring himself against those expectations. Emily confessed that every time she suggested visiting me more often or spending holidays at my house, someone would gently remind them about another business dinner, another networking event, or another family obligation that supposedly could not be missed. None of those conversations sounded cruel by themselves, but together they slowly pulled Daniel further away from the life that had shaped him. Then Emily revealed something that completely surprised me. She said she had argued with her parents after the birthday celebration because she noticed how isolated I had looked that evening. During the argument, her mother insisted they were only helping Daniel build a successful future. Emily answered that success meant very little if it cost someone the relationship with the father who had sacrificed everything for him. Hearing those words filled me with gratitude because I realized she had never stopped respecting our family. She apologized repeatedly for not standing up sooner, but I told her none of this was her burden to carry alone. She grew quiet before saying there was one more thing I deserved to know. A few weeks before the birthday party, Daniel had privately declined a generous financial gift from her parents because he wanted to earn his own achievements instead of receiving them. Emily believed that decision disappointed them more than they admitted. Since then they had increased the pressure for him to become more involved in their businesses and social circles. Suddenly many of Daniel's recent choices began making more sense. He was not chasing money as much as he was chasing acceptance. Before ending the call, Emily asked whether I would still attend the family dinner scheduled for the coming weekend. She said Daniel truly wanted me there, even if he struggled to express it properly. I looked toward the framed photograph of my wife sitting on the living room shelf and remembered the promise I had silently made while reading her journal. Love first. Judgment later. I told Emily I would come. She thanked me with obvious relief before quietly adding that she believed something important was about to happen. After hanging up, I walked outside onto the porch as the evening breeze moved gently through the old maple tree beside the house. For the first time since everything had begun, I no longer saw only disappointment. I saw a family standing at a crossroads where one honest conversation could either heal years of growing distance or allow silence to become permanent. I had no idea that the upcoming dinner would reveal a secret hidden for nearly 3 decades, one that would forever change the way every member of both families understood the past. The family dinner arrived sooner than I expected. On Saturday afternoon I put on the same clean flannel shirt and denim jacket that had always been enough for every important occasion in my life. Before leaving, I quietly opened the desk drawer and looked once more at the unsealed envelope my wife had written for Daniel. I considered bringing it with me, but after a long moment I gently placed it back inside the drawer. The time still did not feel right. When I arrived at Emily's parents' home, Daniel greeted me at the front door before anyone else could. His smile was genuine, and without hesitation he reached over and embraced me. The gesture surprised both of us because it had been years since either of us had done something so natural. Emily welcomed me warmly and thanked me for coming. Throughout the evening I noticed small differences that I had never paid attention to before. Daniel frequently glanced in my direction as though making certain I felt included in every conversation. Emily quietly sat beside me whenever discussion shifted toward unfamiliar business topics, making sure I never felt isolated. Even her parents appeared more restrained than usual. Dinner progressed peacefully until one of Emily's distant relatives asked Daniel whether he planned to accept the executive position that had recently been offered through the family business. Before Daniel could answer, Emily's father confidently explained that it was an extraordinary opportunity and that joining the company would finally place Daniel among people who truly understood success. The room became unusually quiet. Daniel slowly placed his fork on the table before speaking. He thanked his father-in-law for believing in him but admitted he had not yet made a decision. Then he said something none of us expected. He explained that during the past several weeks he had begun questioning whether chasing approval from influential people had caused him to neglect relationships that mattered far more. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. Emily reached beneath the table and gently held his hand. Her father looked disappointed while several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Finally, Emily's mother quietly asked what had brought about such a change in perspective. Daniel looked directly toward me before answering. He said he had recently spent time remembering the people who taught him honesty, perseverance, gratitude, and compassion long before anyone offered him impressive titles or professional opportunities. He admitted that somewhere along the way he had confused advancement with fulfillment. Hearing those words filled me with both relief and sadness because I knew how difficult it must have been for him to say them aloud in that room. No one spoke for several moments. Then, unexpectedly, Emily's elderly grandmother broke the silence. With a gentle smile she said that the richest people she had ever known were not those with the largest homes but those whose children still wanted to visit them after they grew older. Her simple observation changed the atmosphere immediately. Conversation gradually returned, though it felt warmer and more honest than before. As dessert was served, Emily quietly leaned toward me and whispered that this was only the beginning. She explained there was something her grandmother wanted to tell both Daniel and me after everyone else had gone home. Looking across the table, I saw the elderly woman watching us with thoughtful eyes, as though she had been carrying a story inside her heart for many years and had finally decided that the moment had come to reveal it. After the last guests departed, the house became unusually quiet. Emily's grandmother invited Daniel, Emily, and me into the small sunroom overlooking the back garden. She waited until the door was closed before speaking. Her voice was gentle, yet every word carried the confidence of someone who had decided it was finally time to tell a long-protected truth. She looked directly at me first and thanked me for coming despite everything that had happened. Then she turned toward Daniel and said there was something he deserved to understand before making any more decisions about his future. Nearly 30 years earlier, when Emily's father was struggling to build his first business, he had faced a financial setback that threatened everything he had worked for. Banks refused additional loans, investors withdrew their support, and several employees feared they would lose their jobs. During that difficult season, my wife had learned about the situation through a mutual acquaintance. Without telling anyone, she convinced me to lend a significant portion of our savings. It was money we had spent years putting aside for home improvements and future security. We never considered it an investment. We simply believed that helping another family through hardship was the right thing to do. Emily's grandmother explained that I had insisted on one condition. I did not want my name mentioned because I believed kindness should never become a source of obligation. Emily's father eventually recovered financially and quietly returned every dollar with heartfelt gratitude. Over time, however, the story remained known only to a few older members of the family. Emily's grandmother lowered her eyes and admitted that as success grew, gratitude slowly faded into distant memory. She regretted allowing that silence to continue for so many years. Daniel looked completely stunned. He slowly turned toward me and asked why I had never told him. I smiled sadly and answered that parents do not help others so their children can admire them. They do it because someone once taught them to leave the world a little kinder than they found it. Emily wiped tears from her eyes while gently squeezing Daniel's hand. Across the room, Emily's father remained silent for a long time. Finally he stood, walked toward me, and admitted that he had almost forgotten who had first believed in him when almost no one else did. He confessed that somewhere along the path from survival to success, he had begun measuring people by achievements instead of character. Looking directly into my eyes, he apologized for allowing pride to cloud his judgment and for creating an atmosphere that made my son believe he had to choose between family and acceptance. The room fell completely silent. Daniel slowly rose from his chair and looked at me with tears gathering in his eyes. He admitted that hearing this truth made him realize he had spent years trying to earn respect from people whose lives had already been touched by the quiet generosity of the father he had unintentionally taken for granted. At that moment I remembered the unopened envelope waiting in the drawer at home. Deep inside I knew the time my wife had written about was finally approaching, because for the first time in many years my son was no longer searching for success. He was searching for the way back home. That evening Daniel insisted on driving me home himself. The ride back to my small brick house was quieter than any conversation we had shared in years, yet the silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. As we pulled into my driveway, neither of us hurried to leave the truck. We simply sat looking toward the front porch where the light my wife had always left on after sunset still welcomed us home. Daniel finally broke the silence by saying he had spent so many years trying to become someone impressive that he had slowly forgotten the man he had always wanted to become. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder and reminded him that recognizing a mistake was often the first step toward correcting it. Inside the house I asked whether he would like one more cup of coffee. He smiled and answered that he had missed my coffee more than he realized. While the coffee brewed, I quietly walked to my desk, unlocked the drawer, and removed the envelope my wife had addressed to him years before. I returned to the kitchen and placed it gently in front of him without saying a word. He looked at my handwriting first, then immediately recognized his mother's. His hands trembled as he carefully unfolded the letter. The room remained completely silent while he read every line. My wife had written that she knew life would someday offer him opportunities she and I could never imagine. She hoped he would embrace every blessing that came his way, but she warned him never to allow success to convince him that the people who loved him before his achievement somehow mattered less afterward. She reminded him that respect earned through kindness lasted longer than admiration earned through status. Near the end she wrote something that brought tears to both our eyes. She told Daniel that if he was reading her letter, it meant he had reached a crossroads where he could either continue chasing approval from strangers or return to the people who had always loved him without conditions. She ended with a simple request. She asked him to care for me the way I had cared for him when he was too young to understand sacrifice. Daniel folded the letter slowly before covering his face with both hands. Through quiet tears he admitted that he had spent months convincing himself he was building a better future, while never noticing he was slowly walking away from the foundation that had made every future possible. He apologized for every ignored phone call, every missed holiday, every moment he made me feel less important than people who had entered his life only recently. I listened without interrupting because no speech from me could have carried more weight than the words his mother had left behind. When he finished speaking, I embraced him the same way I had when he was a frightened little boy after his first day of school. There was no anger left inside me, only gratitude that we had found each other again before regret became permanent. As Daniel prepared to leave, he made one quiet promise. Beginning the following Sunday, family dinners would no longer belong to business schedules or social expectations. They would begin again around the old kitchen table where our family story had always started, and for the first time in many years I believed that promise would truly be kept. The following Sunday arrived with a quiet sense of anticipation that I had not felt in many years. Just before noon I heard a familiar truck pull into my driveway, followed by another car a few moments later. When I opened the front door, Daniel and Emily were carrying grocery bags while Emily's parents stood behind them with warm smiles that seemed far more genuine than any polite greeting we had exchanged in the past. Emily's father stepped forward first and held out an old wooden recipe box. He explained that after returning home from the dinner, he had searched through family keepsakes and found several handwritten recipes my late wife had once shared with his family many years ago. He admitted they had forgotten where those treasured cards had come from until his mother reminded everyone of the kindness that had helped them during their hardest season. He said he wanted those recipes to return to the home where they had first been written. I accepted the box with quiet gratitude, feeling as though another small piece of my wife had found its way back to me. Together we prepared lunch in my modest kitchen. Daniel insisted on standing beside me while we cooked, asking questions about recipes he had watched me make throughout his childhood but had never learned himself. We laughed when he accidentally added too much pepper to the mashed potatoes, and for the first time in many years our conversation felt completely natural. There was no discussion about careers, investments, or social expectations. We spoke about family vacations, old fishing trips, Christmas mornings, and the countless ordinary memories that had quietly built our lives together. During the meal Emily's father stood and asked if he could say something. He admitted that he had spent years believing wealth was measured by accomplishments, influence, and financial success. Looking around my small dining room, he confessed that he finally understood true wealth was reflected in relationships that remained strong through hardship, forgiveness freely given, and love that expected nothing in return. He thanked me not only for helping his family decades earlier but also for showing him that humility could accomplish what pride never could. Daniel then looked toward the empty chair where his mother had always sat and softly said that although she was no longer physically present, she had somehow guided every one of us back to this table. No one spoke for several moments because every heart understood the truth of those words. Before everyone left that afternoon, we walked together onto the front porch. Emily suggested making Sunday lunch a permanent family tradition, rotating between our homes but always keeping one promise. No business meetings, no professional obligations, and no social expectations would ever take priority over that shared time together again. Everyone agreed without hesitation. As I watched their cars disappear down the quiet Kentucky road, I remained on the porch for a long while, listening to the wind move gently through the maple tree my wife and I had planted shortly after Daniel was born. I realized that my greatest gift had never been the sacrifices I made or the help I quietly offered others. It was refusing to let disappointment replace love, exactly as my wife had hoped. In the end, my son did not return because he discovered an old family secret. He returned because truth opened his eyes, forgiveness opened his heart, and love patiently kept the front door unlocked until he found his way home. Several months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and wonderfully new. Every Sunday our family gathered around one table, sometimes at my house, sometimes at Daniel and Emily's, and occasionally at her parents' home. The location changed, but the purpose never did. We shared meals, laughed over old memories, and created new ones without anyone checking a business calendar or rushing to another social event. Daniel gradually found a healthier balance between his career and his personal life. After careful thought, he accepted a position that allowed him to continue growing professionally while maintaining the values that had shaped him from childhood. He no longer measured success by titles alone. Instead, he often said the greatest achievement of his week was keeping the promises he made to the people he loved. Emily continued to be the quiet bridge that held both families together. She organized birthdays, holiday dinners, and simple weekend visits that reminded all of us how powerful ordinary moments could become when everyone was fully present. Her parents also changed in ways that surprised even themselves. Emily's father began mentoring young entrepreneurs in town, encouraging them not only to build profitable businesses but also to build honorable lives. He often repeated that integrity was the one investment that never lost its value. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel asked if we could visit the small cemetery where his mother rested. Together we stood before her headstone beneath a sky filled with golden leaves drifting gently through the cool Kentucky air. Daniel placed a bouquet of white lilies beside the stone and quietly thanked his mother for leaving behind wisdom instead of resentment. He admitted that her letter had become something he reread whenever life tempted him to confuse ambition with purpose. As I listened, I realized that even after all these years, she was still guiding our family with the same quiet strength that had defined her entire life. Before leaving the cemetery, Daniel turned toward me and said there was one promise he wanted to make in front of his mother. If he and Emily were ever blessed with children, they would grow up knowing exactly who their grandfather was, not because of stories about sacrifice or hidden generosity, but because they would experience his love firsthand every single week. Those words meant more to me than any apology ever could. As we walked back to the truck, I looked across the peaceful countryside and thought about everything that had happened. The painful conversations, the misunderstandings, the hidden letters, and the unexpected truths had never really been about money or social status. They had been about remembering what truly lasts when every achievement eventually fades. A loving family, a forgiving heart, and the courage to choose people over pride would always outlive wealth, recognition, or influence. When I returned home that evening, I placed my wife's journal back into the wooden box beside her wedding ring and the old family photographs. This time I closed the lid with complete peace in my heart. Her final wish had been fulfilled. Our son had found his way back, not because life became easier, but because love remained patient long enough to welcome him home. And in the end I discovered that the greatest inheritance any parent can leave is not found in property, savings, or success, but in a life that quietly teaches the next generation how to love without conditions and forgive without keeping score. 1 year later our family hardly resembled the one that had once drifted apart without realizing it. The greatest changes were not found in larger accomplishments or impressive milestones but in the countless ordinary moments we refused to overlook. Every Sunday afternoon the old kitchen table remained full, and every empty chair had become a reminder that relationships needed to be chosen again and again. Daniel often arrived early simply to help me prepare lunch, and over time he mastered every recipe his mother had once taught me. He joked that learning to bake a proper pecan pie had become more challenging than any business project he had ever managed. Those afternoons became lessons that reached far beyond cooking. We talked about responsibility, marriage, faith, gratitude, and the quiet discipline of showing up for the people who mattered most. Emily brought the same warmth she had always carried, and I often noticed how naturally she encouraged everyone to share stories rather than opinions. Her gentle wisdom reminded me so much of my late wife that it sometimes felt as though 2 generations of compassionate hearts had somehow joined together to keep our family grounded. Emily's parents also continued changing in meaningful ways. They no longer measured every gathering by professional introductions or business conversations. Instead, they began inviting neighbors, longtime friends, and even former employees to seasonal dinners where everyone was welcomed with equal kindness. Emily's father once quietly admitted to me that success had become far more enjoyable after he stopped trying to prove himself and started trying to serve others. Hearing those words confirmed that genuine transformation rarely happened through humiliation. It grew slowly through humility, forgiveness, and honest reflection. One afternoon, Daniel surprised me by asking if I would accompany him to speak with a group of young professionals at a local community event. He wanted us to share the story of rebuilding trust between a father and son without mentioning names or personal details that belonged only to our family. Standing beside him that evening, I watched him explain that ambition was never wrong unless it demanded the sacrifice of the people who loved you before your achievements. He told the audience that promotions could wait, recognition could fade, and wealth could rise or fall, but neglected relationships became much harder to restore if ignored for too long. As he spoke, I realized I was no longer listening to the uncertain young man who once searched for approval in the wrong places. I was listening to a husband, a son, and a future father who finally understood the true meaning of legacy. On the drive home, he smiled and thanked me once again for never giving up on him, even during the seasons when he had unknowingly pushed me away. I answered with the same truth that had carried me through every difficult chapter of our lives. Parents continue loving not because their children always deserve perfect understanding, but because love was never meant to depend on perfect behavior. That evening, before turning out the lights, I paused beside the wooden box that still rested quietly on my bookshelf. Inside remained my wife's journal, her wedding ring, the faded family photographs, and the empty envelope that had completed its purpose. I smiled, knowing those keepsakes no longer represented hidden pain or unanswered questions. They had become a testimony that patience could outlast pride, forgiveness could heal what silence had wounded, and the richest inheritance a family could ever receive was a heart that never stopped, leaving the front door open for love to come home.